It's my great honour to welcome you all.
It is a very prestigious award. It means the world to me.
They have great senses of humour.
I like to reveal parts of history to them, for I love making history come alive.
They are some of the best people that you can come across.
To help them open their hearts.
I always come back to this quote. How can we be role models to learners if we're not learners ourselves?
It's quite useful to get out of our bubbles, not our COVID ones, and sort of see what else is out there.
By sharing best practice, we can see the whole picture. We can see what really matters.
One of the biggest brains around.
It's easy to forget how much has to happen behind the front line.
As a global schools group, Cognita educates over 55,000 students across 12 countries. We're proud to be Wellbeing Partner at this year's Festival of Education, and we want to share the work that we're doing to prioritise children's well-being. This starts with a clear understanding of what well-being is. We looked at the evidence and created a simple Be Well charter that everyone can use day to day. It gives a clear definition of well-being and then focuses on the specific contributors that influence it. Discover our full Be Well charter video and other resources to use with your students and families at cognita.com.
I really try to not look at myself as just a science teacher. I feel like as a teacher, it's very important to help students grow and develop outside of your lessons. A single teacher believing in you and really believing in you. One teacher doing that can have a large impact, but if you have one or two or three all telling you that and really, really believing in it, it makes you feel like you can achieve anything in the world, honestly.
Welcome to this Festival of Education keynote session, part of the annual Festival of Education, taking place online from the 16th to the 30th of June. This year's festival is free for all teachers and educationalists across education in the UK and beyond. This has only been possible thanks to the support of our incredible partners. A huge thank you to our headline partner, Pearson, our festival partners, BBC Bitesize, Cognita and Teach First, our literary festival partner, Bloomsbury Publishing, and our organising partner, Wellington College, the home of the Festival of Education. We'd also like to thank our incredible speakers. Over 200 leading educationalists and thought leaders will be providing sessions at this year's festival. On behalf of the audience and organisers, thank you. It's time to sit back and get set for our upcoming keynote session. If you wish to ask a question during this session, please head over to our Slido page to submit questions and vote for your favourites. Enjoy this Festival of Education keynote session.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ian Henderson, and I'm co-director along with Shane Mann of the Festival of Education. We hope that you have enjoyed our first ever online festival so far, and that you continue to do so right to the end of today. It gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Paul Kirschner and Dr. Carl Hendrick. Paul needs little intro from me. He is Emeritus Professor of Educational Psychology at the Open University in the Netherlands and holds several other professorial and research offices. His most recent books include How Learning Happens, seminal works in educational psychology and what they mean in practice, about which we're going to hear a lot today. Carl is Paul's co-author of How Learning Happens and also What Does This Look Like in the Classroom? He holds a PhD in education from King's College London and has taught for several years in both the state and independent sectors. If you have any questions, please write them on slido.com using #educationfest as in the on-screen instructions. I hope that we will have the chance to discuss and answer a selection of these questions at the end. But now it's time for me to shut up and leave the floor open for Paul and Carl. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carl Hendrick, and joining me today is the incomparable Paul Kirschner, and we will be talking about the final chapter in our book, How Learning Happens, which is titled The 10 Deadly Sins of Education. But as a good Catholic Irish boy, I have shortened that to the more penitential 7 deadly sins of education, which you can see there. We added in this chapter at the end of the book because we wrote, I think, 28 chapters looking at seminal works in research and what is effective in the classroom. And we wanted to put in a chapter that was about things to be skeptical of, things to be wary of, things that, as Wolfgang Pauli put it, are not even, not only just not right, they're not even wrong. So we're going to kick off with Paul talking about the wonderful learning pyramid.
Yes, thank you very much, Carl. You can see the learning pyramid here. I think you all know it fairly well. It's actually one of the oldest myths in education that we know of. And I'll try to explain to you why it's a myth and actually where it came from. If you look at this, you'll see what's called Dale's cone of experience. Edgar Dale wrote actually the first book on audiovisual methods in teaching. He wrote that in 1946. The second edition came out in 1954. And what he tried to explain to people when making use of audiovisual methods in your teaching is you have to realize that certain audiovisual methods are very, very high in abstraction, while certain other ones are very low in abstraction. For example, text and verbal symbols are very, very abstract. There's no reason why an A looks like it does or sounds like it does. It's a convention that we came to. It's just completely abstract, it has nothing to do with reality. And if you go down this, you say, well, a picture is a little bit more concrete, although you can say that certain pictures that you have aren't concrete at all. I mean, Justice, a woman with a blindfold, a scale, and a sword, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who didn't know our Western judicial system who would be able to understand and explain to you what that is. And it goes down through all the different things, motion pictures, field trips, down to direct purposeful experiences. And that's, if you put your hand in a bucket of ice water, it feels cold. And if you put it into boiling water, you'll probably get 2nd or 3rd degree burns. That's very direct and purposeful experiences. And what some strange person did, originally they found this at the National Training Laboratories in Bethel, Maine, is turned it into a learning pyramid, in which they said, well, if you lecture, you'll understand 5%. If you read, you'll remember 10%. If it's presented in an audiovisual way, like we're doing now, 20%. But the problem with this is there's absolutely no proof for this. There's no empirical evidence for either the fact that this is the case or the numbers there. Some of the things in it are pure hogwash. For example, teaching others is 90%, you'll retain 90%. But the big question is, how did you obtain that knowledge yourself to teach another if you didn't hear it from a lecture, read it, get it from audiovisual? And actually, it's additive. So actually, you can learn 270% of what someone's saying, which means that if it was the case, it would be a really efficient way of teaching, because all you have to do is talk for an hour and you get 3 hours worth of comprehension and understanding. So that's the first myth and why the learning pyramid is wrong. Carl.
So I'm going to talk next about the notion of digital natives, which is a fairly pervasive trope in popular culture. It's based on a paper by Mark Prensky from 2001. And basically the claim is that you have a group of people born sort of roughly after 1980 who have been immersed in technology and are completely different than the previous generation. So looking at the actual paper itself, he says, our students have changed radically. And it's now clear that today's students think and process information fundamentally differently than their predecessors. And the last point here, which I think is the most difficult one, their brains have physically changed. In the paper, he talks about a singularity, a great discontinuity. This is part of a narrative which Audrey Waters calls the Silicon Valley narrative that's in many ways dominated education over the last 20 years. A more serious contribution comes from the World Economic Forum, who in a paper, that's a different slide. Sorry, what's wrong with it? Well, this is what's wrong with it. First of all, like Paul was saying about the pyramid, there's no empirical evidence whatsoever for this. It was not a scientific study. Secondly, evolution doesn't really work that way. So if we think about human symbolic cognition, in the 1970s, there was a view that this began sort of 40, 50,000 years ago. In the last couple of decades, evidence has shown that that's actually probably a lot longer, that human symbolic cognition probably goes back 150,000 years. We've got evidence of things like shells with geometric designs and so forth. But we'll sort of steel man this argument and we'll go with sort of 40, 50,000 years ago, and that's all I need. The next big kind of leap or change is in literacy, which is about 5,000 and 6,000 years ago. The Sumerians in Mesopotamia. These are discontinuities in human cognition that take thousands and thousands of years, and yet there's a claim that within a space of 5-10 years, human beings' brains have dramatically changed, which is just not really supported by the evidence. It's a little bit like saying, well, 100 years ago, we didn't have food blenders, yet here we are still making kids chew food and eat it. Or, today's nutritional system is not designed for the kids that are born into it, which is obviously, nonsense. As I say, it's part of this kind of Silicon Valley narrative. And what the narrative says is that there's something fundamentally broken with education. Schools are disastrous for children. They're bored out of their minds. And what they need is a little bit of Silicon Valley fairy dust sprinkled over them. And as you can see from this picture here, you have all these students on the left there they're having a terrible time. They're probably in some sort of maths lesson, I'd imagine. And on the right here, we've got a bunch of students, and look at them, they're having the time of their lives. They've got some sort of digital box over their heads, and they're wonderful. This, I claim, is a very condescending and patronizing view of what children are capable of. What you will see in many schools is teachers inspiring and enthusing students in a very relational way, without using gimmicks or tricks. Simply, as Bob Dylan put it, just 3 chords and the truth. So I think this is a kind of a debased view of education. Paul will talk more about this later, but the sort of end game of all this then is if you swallow all that, then you shouldn't really be teaching knowledge. You should be teaching 21st century skills, and they often end up looking like this. I'll say 2 things about this. As a general rule, the more abstract and vague and sort of unicorny the skills are, the more useless they are in practice. And secondly, if you've got a kind of any educational initiative that is alliterative in nature, that is to say the 4 C's or the 5 F's or the 15 Q's, either it's a miracle that all the things that you thought of, such as communication, collaboration, critical thinking, creativity, it's a miracle that they all begin with the same letter. Or you basically just made it up to all rhyme or to be alliterative in nature. And now we're going to hear about multitasking.
Yes, this is something that also came out at the time of Mark Prensky. What he did is he viewed children doing 2 or more things with an electronic device and assumed that they were capable of doing this in a good way. But let's first understand what multitasking is, because it's actually a not very well understood concept. Multitasking is not doing 2 things at the same time. It's not walking and chewing gum at the same time. What multitasking is that you're carrying out 2 or more cognitive processes at the same time, thinking processes, information problem solving processes at the same time, and that you can do this with no loss of speed, no loss of accuracy. And this idea came actually from the information processing theorists when we first started dealing with computers. And the idea was our brains were like a CPU, a central processing unit. And we had computers with 2 and now 4 and 8 and 16 cores. And each of those cores, central processing units, is just a little brain and can actually carry out its work completely independent of all of the other 15 or 7 central processing units. That's the way a computer works. That's really, really good. You do get into a problem if they're all done with their task at the same time and they all go into the same output bus in which they have to sit and wait for each other to get out of the exit. But in any event, what they're doing is completely independent of the other. The problem is, Houston, we have a problem. We only have one brain. And we use that brain, that whole brain, for everything we're doing that relates to information processing. If you read, then you're making use of your visual system to read the words. But you're making use of your auditory system and that part of your brain, because you actually, when you're reading to yourself. Yeah? You're also making use of a semantic system, because you're actually at that point in time interpreting what you're reading semantically, but also an associative system and all of those different parts of your brain, because it relates to the meanings of images and sounds and smells and even feelings that you have, emotions. It's all related to each other in your brain. What you're actually doing is task switching. You're switching from one task to another. And so what you do is you see in the image on the right-hand side, in the blue, you start on a task, and at a certain point in time, you're interrupted. Someone walks into the room, you get an email, a text message arrives. And at that point in time, you switch from the cognitive schema that you're busy with at that moment, and you have to change to a different cognitive schema, because chances are nil that the email that came in was directly related to what you were working on. You might have been working on a lesson plan for tomorrow, and the email was about the meeting next week. Okay? So you pay a penalty because you have to go from one cognitive schema to another. You start on that new task, and you complete it, and then you go back to your first task, but you again pay that switching penalty because you have to go back to the original schema that you were working in, your lesson plan, restart it and go into it. And that takes time, but it also, takes longer. And you make more mistakes. You see that when you're working on your lesson plan and that email comes in and it says, we were going to start at 4 o'clock, but Carl has to deal with his children, so we're starting at 4:30. So what do? I want to send an email to you as organizer, to Ian, and say, boy, that Carl, he's always doing this. But instead of sending it just to Ian, who sent the original email, I reply to all, including Carl. Those are the mistakes because your head is different. And what does this mean? It means it takes longer to achieve mastery. Research has shown that mastering a small piece of text without being interrupted took 5 minutes. With interruptions, it took 8 to 9 minutes, but you could achieve mastery. But it also leads to lower scores because 5 minutes or 8 or 9 minutes is 1.6, 1.8 times as much time. But learners don't spend that 1.5 to 2 times the amount of time on studying. So they achieve lower scores. They also miss important things. There was a great piece of research by Strayer who had drivers just driving and talking on a telephone every once in a while, or drunk. Not only did the drunk drivers drive better than the distracted drivers, but also when asked at the end, what color jacket did that little girl have when she jumped out between the two cars, the people who were drunk and the people who were just driving, it was in a simulator, I must say, said, oh, red. And the people who were talking on the telephone said, what little girl? Also, research has shown that constant multitaskers have lower abilities to concentrate in the long term, and it eventually leads to burnout and addiction. So in the classroom, also now online, please close or have your children close the weapons of mass distraction. Now, I know I've been busy for a little bit while, but I'm going to just let you please indulge me for one more corollary sin, and that's the sin of secondhand smoke. That having your laptop open in a classroom as a student is kind of like the new secondhand smoke. We all know that learning depends on attention. But the problem is that research has shown that students having their laptops or their tablets open, 40 to 80% are busy with something else. 81% with emails, 68% instant messaging, 43% with surfing the internet, and 25% with games. And how often are they interrupted in the classroom? Well, in this really great, and is one study that I read, a teacher asked the students to take their mobile phones, put it on their desk, and turn up the volume as high as it can. And they found out that this is what happened. This is what they tallied in the classroom. This many, 165 emails, 210 instas, all within one 45-minute school period. But not only that, in another study, and that was not an N is one study, they found that 40% of the students said they were distracted. But it's not only what they said they were, but if we look at, on the left-hand side, those who are multitasking, or actually task switching, they scored significantly less on the proportion correct on an exam afterwards than those who weren't multitasking. But even more telling is the one on the right. And that was that those who had a view to multitasking So a view to someone else's laptop or tablet that was open scored significantly lower than those who did not see another screen. Carl, we'll go to Googling.
So another pervasive idea in education and indeed in popular culture is this idea that you don't need to know anything anymore because Google. The idea that you should commit things to long-term memory is now obsolete in the age of Google because you can simply just Google whatever you want. And as I say, this is very pervasive in popular culture. Here's an example. This is a journalist on BBC who said, "You do not need to know anything anymore. Knowing things is hopelessly 20th century. The reason is that everything you need to know, things you may previously have memorized in books, will be instantly available on a handheld device." And the second quote I really liked was, "Why waste time learning facts when they're all on your phone, all the time in your pocket, and soon on a tattoo on your arm, or on your shirt, or on a pair of glasses?" A more serious contribution comes from the World Economic Forum, who claim that by one popular estimate, 65% of children entering primary school today will end up working in completely new job types that don't yet exist. And then we have the following claim: unsupervised groups of children can use the internet to learn anything by themselves. Well, I think most people would be able to see through that particular claim, but this stuff is, it's sort of, it's endemic at the minute, I think, in education, and it's hugely problematic. Well, why is it problematic? Well, let's have a look at it in action. Well, some really good research done by George Miller, where he asked a group of students to use a dictionary to look up the alternate meanings of words in order to expand their vocabulary. So they took a word like stir, student looked it up, and then wrote, "Mrs. Morrow stimulated the soup." For eats, the student wrote, "Our family erodes a lot." I think they meant our family eats out a lot. For nice, the student wrote, "The weather outside was ingratiating." And for careful, some student was very meticulous about falling off the cliff. And this will look familiar to many teachers who will teach students particular words or vocabulary or phrases, and then they'll find them not quite used rightly. And that's because there needs to be a kind of a nuanced understanding, a contextual understanding of a particular word, a vocabulary, the context it's in. Another example of this is, let's say a student is looking at something like this. This is a passage from Jekyll and Hyde, which most students, at least in this country, will have to, type of text that we'll have to look at some point. So I've just highlighted all the words here that might be difficult if you're 14 years of age. Austere, mortify, vintages, misdeeds, reprove, extremity, heresy, and quaintly. Now, you could use Google to look up the meanings of these words and not commit these words to memory. But there's a problem. You not only need to know the meanings of these words, but you need to know the meanings of these words in a particular context. So in yellow here, we've got different allusions to things. So when he says in the second line to mortify a taste for vintages, well, the student may well look up and find out what mortify means. They may well look up the word vintages, but they will completely not understand that actually what that means is he's talking about wine, a taste for wine. So he drinks cheap gin in order to mortify this taste for vintages. Unless you are aware of that, unless you know that, unless you can make that connection in the moment, or have somebody, an expert, scaffold the learning for you, then you're sort of flailing around in the dark. The other example here near the bottom, I incline to Cain's heresy. Here, the student they may well be able to look up Cain, but without a knowledge of biblical allusions, the sort of underlying meaning of what is being said is being lost. And finally, I think the best example of this is a website that was created about 20 years ago of a fake Pacific Northwest tree octopus. And a study was done in 2007 where they got students to simply evaluate the website, look at can they trust it, and one of the words they used, reliable. And in the study, just 11% viewed the website as reliable. And actually, this study was replicated 10 years later, and 7% realized that it was a hoax, despite the fact that it referred to the elusive mountain walrus and the fact that the tree octopus feeds on Sasquatch. But I think there's an important point here to take away, and that is that without domain-specific knowledge about a particular area, you are prey to misunderstanding and, in a more serious sense, misinformation. So, no, you can't just Google it. Paul.
Thank you very much. I muted it because my 4 chihuahuas started barking, which I warned people beforehand that could happen. And it might happen again. And if it does, Carl will have to then take over my words. What we're talking about now is 21st century skills. And I don't know about in Great Britain, but in the Netherlands, we're inundated by educrats and gurus who are proposing that we need to concentrate on 21st century skills. And the first thing I have here is just, what is it? As you'll notice, I'm really trying, my life is as a scientist. The first thing I want to do is define it, just like I did with what is multitasking. And this was the original, this is the definition of a 21st century skill as it originally came out in 2008. And I have the word sick there because I found it very strange that the definition of a skill is that it's a competence. So as soon as I saw that, I thought there's something really wrong here. What was that original? That was this. This is the Partnership for 21st Century Skills, P21. And this is the first idea of what it was. And you see some core subjects and knowledge in the center with some skills on the around it. And it's gone through, morphed through a number of going from these 4 things to 6 to 8 to eventually coming out to this with 16 so-called 21st century skills. And there are a number of problems with this. The first problem is that the skills aren't 21st century. Collaboration, problem solving, communication, creativity, they're all age-old skills. No one would possibly think of the fact of saying that Thomas Alva Edison couldn't solve problems because that was in 1890, whereas he's the holder of the most patents in the world. But actually, if we go back to what Carl was talking about, the first writing and reading the Sumerians, because of the fact that at that point in time, between the Tigris and Euphrates River, people started growing grains, which meant that they no longer had to be nomads and move from one place to the other. And that was an incredible solution to a problem. They collaborated with each other and began to live in communities. They communicated with each other because if they were in the community, one person was tanning hides while another was doing something else, and they would barter things to each other, and you had to write it down so that you could keep it. So these are all age-old. They're 6, 8, and actually as old as human race, as the Homo sapiens. The second problem is that the skills are all domain general. Collaboration, problem solving, communication, creativity, it's domain general. But all skills are domain specific. Of course, you can learn a procedure. I know the procedure for carrying out a piece of research, and that's almost the same in biology or chemistry as it is in psychology. But because I don't know very much about biology or chemistry, I only know what the procedure is, but that doesn't mean I can successfully carry it out. I need the knowledge to do it. And finally, many of these so-called skills are traits. If you think about the prior slide, things like adaptability, flexibility, leadership, curiosity, persistence, those are all character traits. And you can, as a teacher, you can encourage those things. You can facilitate it by creating a psychologically safe classroom climate, but you can't teach someone to be a leader or to be curious or to be persistent. So it's just complete hogwash to think, number one, that these skills exist, number two, that they exist in a vacuum outside of knowledge, and number three, that you can even teach many of those. But it even goes further. This hogwash has been so trivialized, these 21st century skills, that we see that it's not only learning that's been trivialized, but if we look at this as the periodic table of 21st century of education with its alliteration 5, 6 C's before we get any further, if you look at it carefully, citizenship, character, you'll see it's great, except there's only one thing missing in this 21st century education. That's content, knowledge, and good instruction. But it's not only now education and learning that's been trivialized, but also you as teachers. Because if we look what the 21st century educator is, he or she is a relationship builder, a learner, a storyteller, an artist, a designer, a leader, an innovator. But there's something missing here. This 21st century educator isn't an expert in anything, isn't a teacher, isn't an assessor. So when you go over to 21st century skills, think about the fact that you're not only trivializing learning, but you're also trivializing education and yourself as an educator. Carl.
The next thing I'm going to talk about is motivation and the idea that motivation causes achievement. And typically, we tend to think about this as having a causal arrow pointing from motivation to achievement. What I want to argue is that actually, I think we've got that the wrong way around. The causal arrow probably goes the other way. And indeed, it might also be helpful to not think about motivation at all. The person who only does things when they're motivated probably ends up doing very, very little. So there is some important work done by Rob Coe in the next slide. I keep coming back to this slide. This was work done thinking about lesson observation, and it's a strange thing to think now that sort of common practice 10 years ago was for a science teacher to go into an English lesson and then assign a numerical grade to the learning in the room or the teacher's pedagogical capacity. And in fact, it's probably still going on in many classrooms. But Coe makes the point that a poor proxy for learning, a poor indicator for learning, is if students are engaged, interested, and motivated. And students can be, they can look very busy and kind of look like they're really doing stuff, but actually very little learning is going on. This also links with research done by Graham Nuttall, who showed that in many of the classrooms that they looked at, each student already knows 40 to 50% of what the teacher is teaching. So they may look busy, they may look motivated, and they may indeed be consolidating some learning, but they're not necessarily in that sort of out of their comfort zone and pushing themselves to really learn something. Probably the front line when we think about motivation is growth mindset. And what I will say is, I think that Carol Dweck has done exceptional work on growth mindset over many decades. And when she's been challenged about her work, she's responded appropriately. I think she's a serious scientist. And I think actually that growth mindset is a good way of thinking in general about learning and about achievement. But I think it's probably more a philosophy than an intervention. When we look at the evidence, the following phrases seem to crop up again and again and again. no effect, no statistical significance. Probably the biggest study done here was by the EEF. And they found that this was done with teachers and students. There was no real effect on the students. Now, I do accept Dylan Williams' argument that there is evidence to show that there's a tiny effect with some interventions, and the cost of them is so low that you might as well do them anyway. But in many cases, I think what's happening is schools are spending an inordinate amount of time on this kind of stuff, and it's not really cutting through or having an impact. I kind of liken this to Niels Bohr's horseshoe, and there's a story of uncertain origin about a journalist who went to visit the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Niels Bohr. And when he went to his house, he's noticed that there was a horseshoe above his door. And he said to Niels Bohr, why have you got a horseshoe, a lucky horseshoe above your door? You're an eminent man of science and reason. Why would you have such a superstitious symbol? And Niels Bohr said, of course I don't believe in it, but I hear that it works whether you believe it or not. And I think that many growth mindset posters are a little bit like Niels Bohr's horseshoe hanging in every school. So Daniel Maus, I think, really puts this quite neatly. The research reviewed shows that the effect of achievement on self-concept is stronger than the effect of self-concept on achievement. And then going back to Graham Nuttall, learning requires motivation, but motivation does not necessarily lead to learning. So we can think about motivation as being a precursor to achievement. And in many schools, we get in people to, quote, motivate the staff or motivate the students. But I kind of think that if you can get somebody in a position where achieving something just becomes a habit rather than being needed to be in the state of motivation, because motivation and feeling motivated is not a common thing. And James Clear puts it quite well. Every action you take is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. I really like that quote. So, you know, what matters is not being motivated to go to the gym. What matters is going to the gym whether you like it or not. Picking up a book and reading it even when you don't feel like doing it. And I think particularly getting kids to sail through that initial discomfort of doing something to get out to the calm waters of achievement is, I think, a far better way than thinking about getting them into this heightened state of motivation before regular habits add up to real achievement.
Indeed, that relates very much to this about this discovery learning. If you try to discover, for example, you're a football player or actually a child who wants to learn to bend it like Beckham, you can be very motivated to kick the ball properly and have it go in the goal. And you put up this line of defenders in front of you, and you kick and kick and kick and kick until your leg is lame because you're trying to discover the way of doing it. You'll probably determine that taking free kicks isn't what you should be doing. If you have a good coach next to you and saying, well, you should plant your foot this way and hit it with that part of the other foot, and you begin to see the slightest curve, all of a sudden, the fact that you're capable of curving the ball, your accomplishment motivates you to continue, whereas the original motivation, if you didn't have the proper instruction, probably would have died out. And now that's the problem with discovery, one of the problems with discovery learning, that discovery learning is the way an expert gains new knowledge. It started in 1955-56, the big hype for this, because the Russians sent a Sputnik up into space, and the Americans thought they had a gap there, and they needed to train and educate engineers and scientists. So they thought, oh, education scientists and engineers, they use discovery to gain new knowledge. We should use that as the pedagogy for the learner. But the problem is the learner isn't an expert. An expert does science, does engineering, but a learner or a novice is learning science, learning engineering. And there are quite a number of differences between experts and novices. We know from many studies, beginning with Mickey Chi in the 80s, in the 70s of the previous century, that an expert has lots of relevant schemata in her or his head, and is skillful in doing things. You know this yourself if you think about your own area of expertise without having to actually remember the rule. It's even the case that when you get to really being a top expert, you don't even know that there's a rule anymore. It's become tacit and implicit to you. Many of those automated processes are ready for easy use and can be transferred to solving a problem in the domain where you have that expertise. And you work forward. I don't know if in England or in Great Britain, if you watched House, the anatomical pathologist, the television program, but he worked forward. He saw something, he came up with a hypothesis, and he did the exact tests necessary to see if his hypotheses were correct. A novice is completely different. That novice doesn't have the schemata available. And you have to remember each step. If you think back to the time that you were learning to do something, you have to think about, now I have to do this, now I have to do that, now I have to do the other thing. That takes a lot of cognitive capacity, which is needed. And problem solving is a very inefficient way of doing that because you don't have the knowledge to solve the problem. So you make use of weak problem solving methods. You work backwards. What you do is you say, okay, I have to get to a certain point. I take my first step. Has that brought me any closer? Is this the proper route? Yes. Okay, I can continue. No, I have to go back. And you continually take these steps and make divergent routes, primarily trial and error. But that is not what the way an expert works and the way an expert solves problems. We know that since 1946, when A.D. de Groot, sorry, you probably call him A.D. de Groot, but for me it's A.D. de Groot, he wrote his PhD thesis on the way a master in chess thinks. And he came to the conclusion, and this was followed up by studies by Chase and Simon in 1973, in which they gave master chess masters and novices or even intermediates different chessboards. And some of those chessboards were relevant, which means they were a real part of a chess game, and other ones which were completely irrelevant. And what they found, what all of them found, is that chess players have this incredible library of chess positions in their head. 50,000, 100,000 chunks of information, which is the reason why a master chess player can play 20 simultaneous games blindfolded, because she or he has those boards in her or his heads, but they were no better than the novices at recalling irrelevant chessboards. So where the chess pieces were just placed in different places and had no meaning. It's not that they think differently, it's that they had more knowledge and more of these schemas in their heads. And the problems for education are that this discovery learning requires too much cognitive load. It makes use of these means-ends analysis, which are primarily trial and error. What you find is that at the end of the process, while the problem might be solved, the next problem, the students begin again at zero with the same weak problem-solving methods. and making the same mistakes. They don't know actually what they did to solve the problem, because the goal is not solving the problem. The goal is learning, and learning required good pedagogy. Discovery learning, as I said, is based upon the epistemology of the expert and on the nature of the child as a biologically primary or secondary learner. And I could give a half-hour lecture on that, which I won't. That's our final slide. I think, Carl, it's your time to do the PR.
Yes, so I think we've got some questions going to come in now. If you want to read more about this, I think if you want to read that chapter, I believe on the Routledge website, there's a free sample, and it's actually that chapter, so you can read more of that. That's our book. There's our contacts, and I think we're now going to go over to Ian, who I think has some questions.
I do indeed. I'm just moving to where I am slightly more sensibly lit. Yeah, we have some really good questions coming up, and I hope we're going to have time to answer a few of those. If any more questions are current for people, please put them on Slido, and I'll try and get to them. The first question I've got is, what does the data about how distracted students are when using technology imply for the long-term place of remote teaching and learning?
If I may try to answer that question first, what it means is the following. You remember that I had the slide saying, close your weapons of mass distraction. The problem with that online teaching is the fact that, let me open my thing, is the problem that while you're in the classroom, you can essentially do your best to control these distractions. You can say to the children, take it off of your desk, although they are distracted when it buzzes in their pockets or whatever, that type of thing. You can say to them, now listen to me, close your laptops at this moment. You can open it up again when it's relevant to make use of your laptop. When they're online, you have absolutely no control over that situation. And I don't know how many people are watching this on YouTube at the moment, but I would be completely amazed that in this 40 minutes of Carl and my talking, if all of them did not answer their phone, answer an email, send a WhatsApp message, or whatever. And we can't control that. So we hope that they've attended to what we were saying, but we have no idea. Now, that's the problem in this online situation. You have absolutely no control over the attention of your students, which makes it, very, very hard for them to effectively learn, because they think that they can listen to what you're saying and also do all the other things, while that's not possible.
Yeah,
I'd say, just to add to that, giving a kid a mobile phone and expecting them to use it in a productive way is a bit like taking them to McDonald's and expecting them to choose the salad. It's just completely unrealistic. So I think,
great analogy.
Yeah, I think we had a year of using virtual learning, and it was really useful. It was really useful, and it was helpful, and it kept us in contact with students. But when we came out of that, almost everybody said, I'm so sick of looking at a screen. I'm so sick of sitting at home, looking at a screen, being distracted, and so on and so forth. Teaching is a relational enterprise. It's based upon people being in a room, looking at each other, listening. Lots of paralinguistic, nodding, looking at each other, the energy of being in the same space. And the idea that we need to utterly replace the classroom, the classroom is not fit for purpose, I think is a nonsense idea. So in terms of the future, yes, in an emergency pandemic situation, but not if we can help it.
Interesting. Thank you. Got a couple of others here. There are several questions with a common theme, so I'm going to try and lump them together if that's okay. First of all, what are your thoughts on the effectiveness of project-based learning? Is it the case that novices can still utilize discovery problem solving, but not as a primary method for learning? And finally, can problem solving lead to learning, brackets, the big umbrella?
Since I wrote the 2006 article on this, I will then take the lead on it, if you don't mind, Carl. First of all, there's a difference between problem-based and project-centered.
Yeah.
Okay? I have absolutely no problem with project-centered as long, or making use of projects, is what I'd say, as long as we first take the time to explicitly instruct the students on what they need to know and be able to do in order to carry out the project. Otherwise, what all they're doing is trying to either solve a problem without the necessary requisite knowledge, which is ineffective and inefficient. So that's number one. Or we get the situation in which children work for 2 weeks on making a video about the Norman invasion. And after 2 weeks, they can do video editing and Lord knows what and make this great thing, but they've spent like 15 minutes on the content of the Norman invasion and what it is and what it meant and what the repercussions were. Or it could be the Magna Carta, or it could be anything like that. I don't think the idea is to spend 2 weeks and learn 15 to 20 minutes of content material in those 2 weeks. I don't find that very efficient or very effective. The second thing is, as I said, the goal of education is not solving the problem, but learning what you need to know to eventually be able to solve the problem. So problem solving is a normal, if you look at Rosenshine's 10 points, there are 2 of the 10, so 20% deal with actual hands-on practice, problem solving, or whatever you want to call it. The first time is under the tutelage, or let's say the scaffolding of the teacher, and the second is completely independent, where the teacher is kind of like standing back and only coming into the equation where it's necessary. Yeah? So it's an integral part. Applying what you've learned in a problem or a project situation is an integral part of the learning process, but it is secondary or tertiary to gaining the requisite or prerequisite knowledge and skills, and that's where explicit instruction plays a role. Carl?
Yeah, I think there's lots of good reasons why you would use those approaches, such as socialization and other reasons. But it seems to me that if you were, for example, learning to drive, if you were to use a lot of those approaches for someone learning to drive, we'd have a huge range of accidents on the road. And I think that in different subjects, it's absolutely necessary. So if you're thinking about drama or PE or something like that, then obviously you need people working in groups, you need them collaborating on all that kind of stuff. But if I want to master something, if I want to know something that's difficult, I want an expert to explain it to me clearly. And everybody has been in that situation where you're trying to kind of guess around and you're sort of flailing around looking for an answer. And it's a mystery to me why, particularly I think in the last, in sort of 10, 15 years ago, that notion of the guide on the side rather than the stage on the stage was de rigueur in education. In fact, there used to be, people would come to lesson observation and they would time the teachers and how long they talked. And, if you talk longer than 8 minutes, it wasn't considered a good lesson. Utter madness. So I think, it's important to think about the context, but as a general rule, I think explaining things clearly is a good way of doing things in general, I would say.
I don't know how many of the people listening read about Bean Dad, who it was a father who was actually bragging about the fact that his daughter wanted to open a can of beans, and he refused to let her, to teach her that, and had her try to discover herself how to open it, and it took her 6 hours to do that. Whereas I think the idea was, if you really wanted to teach her how to open a can of beans, you would have shown her how a can opener works, and then how you take the beans out of it, and you would have been done. And you say, okay, here's another can, try it yourself. I mean, if you have the rest of your life to learn how to open a can of beans or do something like that, now be my guest, but I think education is supposed to be effective, efficient, and enjoyable. And that little girl who spent 6 hours trying to open a can did not have a very enjoyable learning experience.
Thank you. I think you point to one of the other questions on the list here, which might be a good follow-up. And I guess this is partly a devil's advocate question. Is therefore the most extreme form of direct instruction the best way all the time? How do you stop the institutional development of learned dependence?
No, is the answer to that, because there's no, there'll be lots of situations where that's appropriate. There'll be lots of situations where, that's not appropriate. But when you're trying to teach things to kids that they don't really want to learn, or they're not really that interested in, then an initial introduction to that from a teacher, and particularly I think, say in a subject like English teaching, there's a lot to be said for modeling what passion looks like for your subject. And that's where I think, for many kind of 12 or 14-year-olds, they've never seen somebody who knows an awful lot about a subject and who absolutely loves that subject. And they can enlarge and broaden the horizons of those students in a way that's absolutely fascinating. I can remember a teacher coming into a lesson when I was 17 or something and holding up the Odyssey and saying, this book is going to change your life. And he talked about it like, it was a matter of life and death. And it had a huge impact on me, but I'd never seen anybody speak like that before about literature. And as a result, it probably changed the course of my life. But had he been teaching in 2005, 2010, we might have all been in groups, given a picture of the Odyssey going, well, talk for 15 minutes talk to your partner about what you think the picture means, kind of thing.
I myself have a problem with the term, the most extreme form of direct instruction, because direct or explicit instruction isn't giving a lecture. That's only one of the pedagogical techniques that you can make use of, which can be very effective and efficient in certain situations, but not in others. It's kind of like a straw man argument that's constantly used. And I've noticed that since my 2006 article. It's always put away as, okay, you're in favor of pure lecture style teaching. And I'm not. Explicit instruction is not lecture. It's making sure that which you're trying to have the person learn is made explicit and done in the most effective, efficient, and enjoyable way. And there are many, many different techniques, pedagogical techniques that you can make use of and have it still be explicit instruction, including having children solve problems under your tutelage or guidance, or having them do it alone, or making use of retrieval practice, making use of spaced practice. It's a complete toolbox of pedagogical techniques. And if you think as a teacher that the only way to teach is by lecture, it's the same as being a cook and saying the only way to cook is by deep frying. No, then you're a fish and chips bar and not a 3-star Michelin chef. As a teacher, you should make use for explicit instruction of the domain knowledge that you have, the pedagogical techniques that you can make use of, and the tools that you have available, and mix and match them in such a way that you're giving good instruction at the level to the student that the student needs.
Yeah. So if there's this much misinterpretation and misunderstanding of what some of these terms mean, what does that mean for the education profession in general?
It means for me that the teaching universities or colleges teacher training institutes have not taught their students properly. And we did a piece of research in the Netherlands based upon a piece of research in the United States, in which we looked at the learning books and the syllabi of teacher training colleges in the Netherlands and Flanders. It was originally done in the United States at 40 universities. And we found that the most well-researched and well-documented pedagogical techniques, and that was spaced practice, retrieval practice, and also interleaving, were not being taught at the teacher training colleges and universities, but what was being taught is multiple intelligences, learning pyramids, grit, what was that? Mindset theories, what I call divining rod pedagogies. And so there's a real good job necessary at the teacher training institutes to teach their students what good instruction is and how people learn.
Yeah. And sorry, Carl, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I think for many teachers, one thing we've seen in the last 10 years is the democratization of knowledge from education and cognitive psychology. And you see a lot of teachers who are encountering this stuff for the very first time and saying, 5-10 years into their career and saying, well, why haven't I ever heard about this? This is, extraordinary. Dylan Wiliam made the claim a few years ago that cognitive load theory was, quote, the most important thing for teachers to know, which kind of set off a bit of a firestorm. But the response from many teachers was, well, what is it? I don't know what it is. And I think
cognitive load theory is based upon our cognitive architecture, how our minds work. Can you imagine a doctor not knowing anatomy, physiology, and pathology? That's the same as a teacher not knowing what our cognitive architecture is, how it works, and what cognitive load theory is.
Yeah,
that's the situation we have at the moment.
Yeah, and I hear that the point you made about the teacher training institutions, and it sounds like there are whole generations of teachers who are already in the profession and well beyond teacher training who haven't been able to avail themselves of that. So what would be your guidance as a parting question as we come to the end of this? What would be your guidance for the education profession for the next 5 years?
Making sure that all teachers, both working teachers as those who are coming into the profession, understand the 8 basic aspects of the, I think it's the UK government office Department for Education, their core curriculum. There are 8 basic aspects of it, from motivating your students to knowing your area, to knowing how children learn and things like that, making sure that that's known by incoming students at the training colleges, teachers who are just getting out of it, but also teachers who've been teaching 10, 15, 20 years. That needs to be the core of what you're doing as a teacher, just like anatomy, physiology, and pathology is for the doctor, just like the laws and the Constitution, the Magna Carta, are for the advocacy. don't create a new backlog and get rid of the backlog that's there now.
Okay, thank you.
That would be mine, but Carl's the teacher every day. I'm ivory tower.
I would just finally add, I think the early careers framework is a step in the right direction here, but we have had a problem in the last 10, 20 years of many teachers leaving the profession due to workload issues. I think if you're telling teachers, well, you need to plan an individual lesson for each of the learning styles of the student in the room, and if the kids are misbehaving, then it's your fault for not being engaging, and so on and so forth. If what teachers are being told is creating more work for them and the students are learning less, then there's a major problem. And I think that needs, one of the very positive things about the findings from cognitive psychology is that it will lessen the workload on teachers, and it makes a lot more sense in terms of students learning.
Great. Thank you both very much indeed for a really informative, interesting, and indeed engaging, Carl, talk. I haven't misbehaved because you've held my attention.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian.
I hope next time I'll be at EdFest, and like the last time I was there, we can see each other, talk to each other, interact with each other. All of those 21st century skills: communicate, collaborate,
absolutely.
Solve problems together.
Absolutely, and were we all together in person, there would be a very significant and warm round of applause from the assembled people. So if you can imagine that in your virtual world, Shane and I will just act it out. And thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
And Shane, do you have anything? No. Great.
And I'm going to do what I normally would have done if I was at EdFest, and this was the closing keynote. I will now sit down, open a bottle of wine, and have a nice glass of wine with my wife, who's here with me, and enjoy the rest of the day. Next time, I hope it's with all of you at college.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's my great honour to welcome you all.
It is a very prestigious award. It means the world to me.
They have great senses of humour.
I like to reveal parts of history to them, for I love making history come alive.
They are some of the best people that you can come across.
To help them open their hearts.
I always come back to this quote: how can we be role models to learners if we're not learners ourselves?
It's quite useful to get out of our bubbles, not our COVID ones, and sort of see what else is out there.
By sharing best practice, we can see the whole picture. We can see what really matters.
One of the biggest brains around.
It's easy to forget how much has to happen behind the front lines.
As a global schools group, Cognita educates over 55,000 students across 12 countries. We're proud to be Wellbeing Partner at this year's Festival of Education, and we want to share the work that we're doing to prioritise children's well-being. This starts with a clear understanding of what well-being is. We looked at the evidence and created a simple Be Well Charter that everyone can use day to day. It gives a clear definition of well-being and then focuses on the specific contributors that influence it. Discover our full Be Well Charter video and other resources to use with your students and families at cognita.com.
I really try to not look at myself as just a science teacher. I feel like as a teacher, it's very important to help students grow and develop outside of your lessons. A single teacher believing in you and really believing in you. One teacher doing that can have a large impact, but if you have one or two or three all telling you that and really, really believing in it, it makes you feel like you can achieve anything in the world, honestly.
Thank you.